Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 14. Skeldings and Amazons. At the end of the 1st century of the Common Reckoning, a large number of halflings under the leadership of Murdo Hamfist had settled in the plains between the Silver Stream and the Gaptooth Mountains. The land was fertile and the halflings prospered. As the halfling population increased, halfling farmers brought more territory under cultivation, extending their holdings down the south bank of the Silver Stream until they reached the borders of the Skelding kingdom. The Skeldings had previously had trouble with halflings on the north bank of the Silver Stream. They were disconcerted to now be faced with yet more halflings pushing down the south bank of that river. The king of the Skeldings at that time was Gunnlaugh. His first thought was to ride in force into the halfling lands and put the halflings to the sword. But two events conspired to stay his hand. In the 129th year of the Common Reckoning, a terrible plague fell upon the halflings. It appears that this was a variant of the purge pox that had previously swept through the dwarvish populations and had now mutated into a form that was lethal to halflings. A scurrilous rumour of the time claimed that the first halfling to catch this disease was one Falco Hamfist, one of the sons of Murdo Hamfist. The Hamfist family had done very well for themselves, and it appears that Falco was wealthy, and further augmented his wealth by lucrative trading with the dwarves around Unnascrag. It was said that Falco was same-sex attracted, but was in denial about this fact. To prove his masculinity, he had therefore had relations with a dwarvish lady, who he was attracted to because of her beard, and it was thus that he contracted the purge pox. Now, this story does not hold water, for the obvious reason that dwarvish women do not have beards. It must therefore have been invented by a very ignorant halfling. But there is no doubt that the halflings referred to the epidemic as the dwarvish plague. Whatever its origins, while the plague provided Gunnlaugh with an opportunity to strike while the halflings were vulnerable, he did not wish to expose himself and his followers to a disease which, for all he knew, might be transmissible to humans. And then, as he hesitated, Aldric, the warden of Overwater, died. Aldric's family always claimed that Gunnlaugh had promised Aldric that his descendants would inherit his title. It is not clear that Gunnlaugh ever made such a promise, and even if such a promise was made, it is by no means certain that Gunnlaugh ever intended to keep it. But it is certain that Gunnlaugh had made no such declaration in public. Thus, when Aldric's son Fulbert unilaterally declared himself as the new warden of Overwater, this was widely regarded as a direct challenge to Gunnlaugh's authority, a challenge that Gunnlaugh could not permit to stand. Gunnlaugh proclaimed that all of the captains of the Skeldings should arm their retinues and attend upon him at the great hall of Skeld. In front of the assembled company he named his younger brother, Osfrid, as the warden of Overwater, and accepted Osfrid's vow of fealty. He then declared that Fulbert was a traitor and an outlaw, and led the assembled host out to war. Gunnlaugh crossed the Silver Stream at the Silver Ferry, where he found the army of Fulbert awaiting him. A battle was fought, and Fulbert was the victor. Gunnlaugh, Osfrid, and the remnants of their force recrossed the Silver Stream, leaving Overwater to all intents and purposes as an independent state under the rule of Fulbert. Gunnlaugh had thus lost a battle, and half of his kingdom with it. The defeat reduced his standing among the Skeldings, and so undermined his authority. But it did not cost him his throne. There were several reasons for this. Following the battle, Fulbert did not pursue Gunnlaugh over the Silver Stream. Had Fulbert done so, he could probably have marched into Great Hall and made himself king of all the Skeldings. Instead, he contented himself with consolidating his position in Overwater. In the absence of any external challenger for his crown, Gunlaf could only realistically have been overthrown by one of the captains of the Skeldings. But the captains of the Skeldings had shared in Gunlaf's defeat. Indeed, whereas Gunlaf had fought on foot, holding his nerve and bravely organising the orderly retreat of his spearmen, the captains of the Skeldings had fought as the leaders of Gunlaf's cavalry, which had been roundly humiliated in the battle, being unable to ride down the shaken remnants of Fulbert's slingers, and then fleeing the field in abject disarray when charged by Fulbert's cavalry. Thus all the potential internal challengers to Gunlaf's throne were even more discredited by the defeat than Gunlaf was. And Gunlaf had a stroke of luck. Following the sack of Dogopolis, Meitildes, the leading merchant of New Lixia, had been forced to seek new markets. His ships had been pushing ever further westward along the south coast of Halfland, all the way to Far Cape at the southwest corner of the island, without finding any sign of habitation. But it was in this year that one of his ships rounded Far Cape and sailed up the west coast of Halfland, coming to anchor in the estuary of the Silver Stream beneath Great Hall. Gunlaf was quick to seize this opportunity. He was happy for Meitildes to trade with the Skeldings, as long as that trade passed through his hands. He built a harbour at Great Hall, a fine stone harbour, lined with great warehouses, which was known as the Royal Harbour. Gunlaf filled those warehouses with the produce of the estates of his captains, for which he paid the market price. Meitildes' ships would sail into the harbour, laden with all the goods of New Lixia, which would be exchanged for the contents of the warehouses. Gunlaf would then allow his subjects to purchase from him the goods that he had so imported. Gunlaf made a profit, his captains made a profit, and Meitildes made a profit. Skelding gentlewomen were delighted with their purchases of New Lixian lace, and the connoisseurs of New Lixia waxed lyrical about the merits of Skelding cheese, and everyone was happy. In the southwestern corner of Halfland rose the broken heights of the Gaptooth Mountains. The eastern foothills of these mountains were rugged and wooded, and here dwelt the community of women known to us as the Amazons. The Amazons had no fixed abode. They roamed the wilderness, supporting themselves by hunting game and gathering wild plants. From time to time bands of Amazons would descend from the hills into the plains and visit the outlying farms of the New Lixians. Sometimes the Amazons would steal cattle, but more often they would trade with the farmers, exchanging furs for cloth and weapons and other goods. The farmers of New Lixia did not visit the lands of the Amazons, for the simple reason that no man who entered those lands lived. The Amazons were skilled at woodcraft. A male interloper would not know that he was being stalked until an arrow, loosed from a position of concealment, was lodged between his shoulder blades, and by then it was too late. One would have thought that a community of man-murdering women would produce no progeny and thus die out. But over time the population of the Amazons increased. Although the Amazons greeted male visitors with an arrow in the back, they embraced female immigrants with open arms. For many women at the bottom of New Lixian society, a life of freedom in the hills seemed preferable to a life of destitution and exploitation, and a steady flow of such women swelled the Amazons' numbers. It was also the case that many Amazons who visited New Lixian farms traded more than furs, and returned to the hills in a condition of pregnancy. As you can imagine, the respectable women of New Lixia did not approve of the Amazons, and they said terrible things about them. One of the most common stories was that the Amazons sacrificed their male children to the goddess Pero, who appears to have been a deification of one of the founders of the Amazon tribe. Many feminist historians have denied that any such infant sacrifice occurred. However, the stories were almost certainly true. There are a number of apparently genuine contemporaneous accounts of Amazons who gave birth to male children and then fled to New Lixia rather than cut the throat of their baby at the feet of the goddess. New Lixian society regarded both Amazons and single mothers with contempt, and so these returning females would have faced a miserable existence. Under such circumstances, the motherly affection thus demonstrated by these benighted women can only be admired. As the numbers of the Amazons increased, so they wandered further afield. In the same year as the Battle of Silverferry, an Amazon named Anticlea found herself in the high passes of the Gaptooth Mountains and crossed the watershed. She thus became the first Amazon to see the lands to the north of those mountains. At her feet the land fell away down to a broad plain, a patchwork of halfling farmland stretching for many miles. In the far distance the wide waters of the silver stream glinted in the sunlight. It seems that Anticlea descended from the hills and reconnoitred this territory and its inhabitants. She then recrossed the mountains, telling of a promised land rich with cattle, ready for the taking, guarded by only a few sickly children. Thus, gathering a band of Amazons to her, she swept down from the hills at its head, robbing her way across the halfling territories, living off the fat of the land. At this time, the dwarvish plague was still running rampant through the halfling population. Dazed and confused, the halflings put up no real opposition to the Amazon incursion, until Anticlea and her followers were a few miles away from the market town of Elmgrove, which they had determined to ransack. Faced with the destruction of their town, the halflings of Elmgrove hastily assembled a ramshackle army, which interposed itself between Anticlea and her objective. A bloody battle was fought, in which both sides suffered heavy casualties, but at the end of the day it was the Amazons who withdrew from the field, and Elmgrove was saved. Anticlea and her horde retreated back the way they had come, overwintering in the halfling territories she had already pillaged, before retiring back into the mountains in the spring of the 130th year of the Common Reckoning. Halflings are a prosaic race. The desolate majesty of the Gaptooth Mountains sparked no flights of romantic fancy in their mundane halfling souls. If they had ever previously raised their eyes to the broken rocky pinnacles looming over them, they had done so with indifference. But now they beheld the mountains with fear. Unfortunately for the halflings, they were looking in the wrong direction. While they rebuilt their farms and kept a watch on the mountains to the southeast, a Skelding army marched against them from the west. This army was led by Osfrid. He was still smarting from the defeat at Silverferry, where the wardenship of Overwater had been taken from him by Fulbert. Well, Overwater had been taken from the halflings on the north bank of the Silver Stream. If he could not have Overwater, he could carve out a territory for himself from the halfling lands on the south bank. Thus, while Gunlaf consoled himself for the loss of half his kingdom with commercial speculations, Osfrid determined to obliterate the humiliation of defeat by winning a greater victory, and territory, and riches, and power to boot. There was no shortage of Skeldings willing to follow Osfrid in this venture. Many of the captains who had fled at the Silverferry were happy to have an opportunity to restore their reputation for martial prowess. Many younger sons of captains were happy to have an opportunity to carve out a fiefdom of their own. Many of the lesser nobility and common people were happy to have an opportunity to win land and wealth and independence. All in all, nearly 300 men flocked to Osfrid's banner. And so it was that, for the second time in 12 months, a hostile army marched upon Elmgrove, and, for the second time in 12 months, a battle was fought on the outskirts of that town. But this time the halflings were defeated. The Skeldings took Elmgrove. But Osfrid did not succeed in winning himself a territory. Instead, he lost his life in the battle, run through by a halfling spear. His followers descended into anarchy, prowling the country surrounding Elmgrove, killing halflings and fighting between themselves over the land. When Gunnlaugh heard of these events, he assembled the full body of the king's spearmen and led them to Elmgrove, where he restored order. Having done so, he methodically cleared the land of any remaining halflings, and then divided it into estates. The finest of these he retained for himself. The remainder were allocated to those of his loyal subjects that he considered most deserving of his favour. And he appointed no warden over the new won lands, but ruled them directly. He had no desire to create another Fulbert. With the annexation of Elmgrove, the halfling town of Muffins now found itself in proximity to the Skelding frontier. This caused considerable concern to the local population, who were also inconvenienced by the influx of a large number of refugees from Elmgrove. But telling of the results of those developments will have to wait for another day.